everyone to the Penny Stamps Distinguished Speaker Series and the Acadia 2016 Conference. Today we present two extraordinary talents who, when put together, are proof of the Kuleshov effect that says 1 + 1 definitely equals more than 2. That would be architect Philip Beasley and fashion designer Iris van Herpen. Yeah. Aye. Today's program is made possible by a special partnership, the Acadia 2016 conference happening here with us and amongst us today. So a special welcome to all the conference attendees in our midst, and a word of explanation for all of those who have no idea what that is. Acadia is an acronym which stands for Association for Computer-Aided Design in Architecture, and this year's conference is titled Post-Human Frontiers. The conference brings together architects, designers, material scientists, engineers, programmers, and artists to explore current trends in computational design and the generation of mechanisms for interfacing with the physical realm. And I think we're going to learn something about that this evening. It's taken a number of people and organizations to bring this program here today. It has not been just a smooth, easy road, folks. So I want to give a hearty thanks to all of you, to Acadia, to the Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning for your partnership, and for additional support, many thanks to Autodesk and the Grand Rapids Art Museum and Michigan Radio 91.7 FM. Now, it just so happens that the Grand Rapids Art Museum has just this past weekend opened the exhibition Iris van Herpen Transforming Fashion. This exhibition features 45 original creations by our acclaimed guest, Iris, and this exhibition is on view through January the 15th at the Grand Rapids Art Museum, which is just down the road. So we have time and we have holidays to take this in. There is information which should be available in the lobby on your way out, on the information table or on the small table in the outer lobby. Or you can find it online at artmuseumgr.org. Not to be missed opportunity. And next week, for those of you with the design bit in the audience, we have another design moment, so don't miss it. Fred Gelly, design director from the recent Olympic Games in Brazil, will be joining us here next Thursday. The run of show today, a little bit different, and please do remember to turn off your cell phones. This is a two-part show with 3 players. All of them deserve long introductions, but with respect for time, I'm going to give you just enough background to get the ball rolling. And I'm going to do this in backwards order. There will not be a Q&A today. With an eye on giving you the best of all worlds, we're going to begin today with a keynote address by Philip Beasley, which will then segue into a conversation between Philip and Iris, which will be moderated by only the most quintessentially appropriate person to do so, Sarah Schlunning. Sarah Schlunning is Curator of Decorative Arts and Design at the High Museum of Arts in Atlanta, Georgia. She curates exhibitions exploring creativity, innovation, and design strategies. Her shows range from contemporary fashion to design history, and it just so happens that she is the curator of the current exhibition in Grand Rapids, Iris van Herpen Transforming Fashion. Prior to the High Museum, she was curator at the Wolfsonian in Miami Beach, and she was also assistant curator at the Cranbrook Art Museum just down the road in Bloomfield Hills, so not a stranger to us. And she has recent publications, most recently including exhibition catalogs for the Iris van Herpen exhibition and for Dream Cars. A little background on Iris. Iris van Herpen is a Dutch fashion designer who has gained international acclaim of her combination of traditional hand craftsmanship and innovative experimental techniques and materials, including the world's first examples of 3D printed fashion. She studied fashion design at Artes Institute of Arts Arnhem and interned at Alexander McQueen in London and Claudia Jongstra in Amsterdam. She immediately caught the eye with notable shows, and since 2011, she has been a guest member of the prestigious Parisian Chambre syndicale de la haute couture, which is part of the Fédération Française de la Couture, which is a super big deal. Super, super big deal, guest member. Her label stands for reciprocity between craftsmanship and innovation in technique and materials. She creates a modern view on haute couture that combines fine handwork and digital technology and forces fashion to the extreme contradiction between beauty and regeneration. It is her unique way to reevaluate reality and so to express and underline individuality. Each of her designs require a unique treatment of material and sometimes the creation of completely new materials. And for this reason, she prefers interdisciplinary research, and she often collaborates with other artists and scientists, like our illustrious guest giving us the keynote this evening, Philip Beasley. And for a proper introduction of Philip, I have asked my real partner in crime on this endeavor to tackle it. And because I would be remiss for you not to be introduced to the other force behind this evening. He is currently serving as the Acadia 2016 Conference Chair, in addition to his day job as the Associate Dean for Research and Creative Practice and an Associate Professor of Architecture at the Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning. Please welcome Jeffrey Toon.
Thank you very much, Christina. I would also like to welcome all of the conference attendees, members of the University of Michigan community and broader public. I am certain that this will be a truly special evening and a singular opportunity for us to host Philip Beasley and Herpen van Herpen in conversation. It is a true pleasure to introduce Philip Beasley, a practicing visual artist, architect, and professor of architecture at the University of Waterloo, and professor of digital design, architecture, and urbanism at the European Graduate School. He is a director of the Living Architecture Systems Group and director of the Riverside Architectural Press. Beasley's work spans the disciplinary practices of architecture, science, engineering, visual art, industrial design, digital prototyping, mechatronics, and instrument design, and has been undertaken through long-standing collaborative exchanges with some of the most challenging thinkers and makers of our time, including couture designer Herpen van Herpen and futurist Rachel Armstrong. The work has been extensively published and exhibited widely to worldwide acclaim. I've known Philip since I was a young architect working in Toronto, and have had the pleasure and opportunity to collaborate with him on a number of projects, through which I came to know his tenacious, optimistic, and sometimes ferocious but gentle spirit. He is well known to the Acadia community as both an active member and a most generous mentor and teacher. He has helped to advance the thinking and ambitions for what architecture may be for many of us in this room. His work never ceases to inspire and astonish with its complexity, its beauty, and its near-living qualities. Please join me in welcoming, for the first time at the University of Michigan, Philip Beasley.
Colleagues, thank you so much for having me here. Jeff, Kathy, Matthias, Sean, all the chairs of Acadia, thank you for your extraordinary work, and Christina and everyone at Penny Stamps and Grand Rapids. I'm going to offer you some comments that try to articulate what I think I can argue is a vision for architecture and design today. And this is founded on a sense of standing on the ground. If I was standing on the historical ground, on the ground of my parents perhaps, then I would have this most delicious sense, I think, of being able to rely on the world being solid, of being eternally there, of holding me, of nature wrapping up every bit of our energy and absorbing us and carrying us and challenging us. What a lovely kind of prospect for architecture and design to work with, being able to project against that firmament, that eternal foundation. And what of the ground that I stand on today? Trembling, unspeakably insecure. How can we speak of our future today when we think of a planet that has changed fundamentally, of nature for which we have fundamental questions about life and survival and viability? This sense might very well impel us to change our attitude about design, and perhaps it would be completely understandable if we were impelled to wrap the tightest possible circles around our work, seeking a kind of a no-trace camping, perhaps, or a radical sustainability in which the minimum possible consumption is possible. And yet, such retreat into encapsulation and into the enactment of boundaries is something that surely does not speak of life. My hope is that we might speak instead of a kind of projection in which what we do might create fertility, might create renewal, might create an extraordinary kind of transformation of pluripotency, of multivalent, many resonant, rippling lands around ourselves and our bodies. An architecture that creates true healthy possibility and fertility. I hope that I can earn that kind of optimism by sharing some craft. The conversation that I'm going to share tonight is based on a very special friend, my dear beloved Iris. And the kind of work that we have spun together has involved creating a kind of sensitivity of jackets and possibility sheaths, rippling out from our bodies, harvesting vibrations, seeking a kind of interaction with the world. More recently, we've also started to work with light and consciousness and a kind of hesitation as well, thinking about the doubling of ourselves, thinking about removal from ourselves, thinking about floating and lofting. Within my own work, I've been focusing very particularly on intimate touch, a kind of sense of the animation in which each trembling gesture might amplify and reach out beyond us. And that in turn reaches to a sense of not completely a wilderness, but certainly a deeply entangled, reticulated, kind of pluripotent ground, a sense of possibility. In some gestures, such as in the Venice Biennale installation for the Canadian Pavilion, this work has acquired a certain kind of symphonic confidence of many layers of hyperbolic scaffolds above and basket-like columns and rippling helical sheaths of breathing pores. And in that kind of work, individual gestures start to chorus in individual sparks which acquire conversations, using very simple microprocessor arrays in order to bloom out in rippling chains of reaction, seeking not so much an amplification of our presence, but rather a kind of chorusing resonance in which we might shout and call and listen and be heard. In a recent project in Shanghai, the work started with a shadow play on the ground, and then in the air, many thousands of individual vessels holding prototype cells, protocells, individually actuated and rippling through to make a great canopy that would reach out beyond us, rising up through cloud-like materials. a sense of an architecture of possibility which trembles and resonates and ripples. Rising above in that sense, there are very small individual gestures that ripple out and resound, made of individual digitally fabricated elements, thermally expanded spars which are multiplied in a hexagonal weave, and then shift register-based Arduinos which set up a chorus of interaction. The individual elements make a kind of an embroidery which hang above our heads, a canopy or a baldacchino, which then respond to individual blooms of gesture. And the individual elements then are spun out of glass and acrylic and metal, holding beds of oil, some oil heavier than water, other oil lighter than water, and the smallest individual vesicles of chemicals bedded in between, a kind of weightlessness that allows blooming precipitation to start. Just the very start of a kind of an inorganic renewal that might one day reach outside of those vessels and start to clothe the environments in a renewed skin. Here you can see the individual precipitations, this lovely kind of ferrous felt that works by osmosis as it blooms out within those oil systems, stimulated by individual bursts of LED light. In a slightly earlier project, the concentration in Korea for epiphyte chamber was in making a fertile scaffold made of individually thermally expanded spars, which were linked together into a great blooming, very, very resilient skin that would be capable of being deeply loaded with elements. Within that kind of canopy, there were layers of electronics, each heavily loaded, and then also internal batteries made of vinegar. Here you can see the layers, the stratification in this project. Individual vinegar cells, which are massed together using chained individual series connections, making triggering voltages, which then chorus and make a kind of a glossolalia of speech which runs behind our own action as we move through this environment. As we move backward through this environment, you can start to see the sense of it being a canopy for gathering. Perhaps not a confident public architecture, certainly not a parade or a great public square, but I do hope that this could be conceived as a kind of gathering space for individual gestures, the kind of couplings and small gestures of communities where conversation might start and then reach out and wonder and reach again. Perhaps it might be possible to work within the shadow play that are at the edges of our perception in this architecture as well. The sense that architecture might start to speak of weather and of diffusion and of the outer realms of our perception, far beyond a sense of control. Embedded within that skein, that membrane-like world, the clouds, are individual elements which are quite carefully crafted, shape memory alloy generated tentacles which individually reach and which are fitted with space sensors so that each touch and gesture is responded to in turn by stroking and gesturing. And then when those are orchestrated together, the elements start to speak and brush in choruses that ripple and resound and produce great orchestrated kinds of responses, waves of responses through the entire space. Tremendously interesting kind of hybrid behavior happens in this environment too, in the thicket. Not simply the pre-scripted gestures which are there and the chained reactions through the multiple microprocessors and the machine learning, but also interference and noise which starts to set up recycling and a kind of a chorusing which depends utterly on the immanence of physical activity as well, not simply the intentions. that kind of cycling offers a tremendously interesting kind of new reaction. That is the kind of reaction that's based on the utter physicality of our bodies, the interference of the bending and the gesturing and the stretching of our nerves and our sinews and our proteins. That physical material working together with the computation seems to have tremendous potential for a renewed architecture. Now, the work that I've been sharing might relate to a sense of thermodynamics that works according to very familiar laws. The kind of law, for example, that says that things are pure first and condensed and highly ordered, and then which decay into entropy. I'm reciting the second law of thermodynamics when I say that. This sense somehow that embedded in our culture is an assumption that things that are transcendentally conceived as ideas first are destined somehow to decay into the world, ultimately falling apart, entropy as a kind of a loss. What a curious kind of preconception we have if we believe that. If we believe that the world is a compromise somehow. If physicality is somehow a disappointment. It's so utterly embedded in our culture, this sense of order decaying into entropy as a loss, that we might see it as a kind of a design paradigm, an assumption, as if we have to fight and continually work to purify and distill and render minimal. And yet, what tremendously interesting new paradigms are emerging in this last 20 years, and certainly in the last 50 years. Perhaps Ilya Prigogine, the wonderful chemist and physicist of last century, who conceived of forms and objects which stand in between that pure crystalline order and entropy, and instead the kind of dissipative form language, the sense that in this world, rained on by the sun and driven by the wind and the water, that standing waves and resonance create absolutely tenacious forms, dissipative forms, which last and which are resilient and which are adaptive. The sense that instead of believing that transcendental ideas or absolute decay is our lot, instead life is possible, is an absolutely viable adaptive state. And Jeremy England, the new physicist, the young physicist, working in Prigogine's stead, has said tremendously interesting things most recently about dissipative adaptation, this sense that humans and living things actually are a unique class of dissipation, which optimize the generation of entropy. This sense, then, that entropy, rather than being a condition of loss and of decay, might instead be a condition of maximum potential. What a beautiful kind of conception of the flux of the world. The sense, then, that life might be pulled out of us by the world. The sense, then, that renewal might be fostered by maximum interaction and maximum reactivity and maximum sensitivity, rather than needing somehow to create boundaries and absolute walls to things as being an inevitable way of protecting ourselves. This sense, then, that sensitivity and vulnerability is an absolutely viable way to create the most substantial architecture is one that I find tremendous encouragement from the advent of new physics. There's some craft that can help this work. Schlieren photography, for example, this beautiful sense of surfing the differential of photography in which we can see the fluxing of light, making it possible for even sound and transpiration and the convection currents around our body to all become design spaces available to architects. The extraordinary kind of advent of CERN, the great array of sensors wrapped around each one of these leaves of the enormous 27-kilometer accelerator and the Large Hadron Collider, allowing us to see the most minute elements, detecting and understanding difference. And a design space, too, with computation in which not simply optimizing energy or finding an absolute form language, but instead detecting the conditions for pluripotency itself. We're looking in this model at quasi-geostrophic turbulence, this lovely term, quasi meaning undulating and perhaps even hiccuping or convulsing, geostrophic meaning turning, the turning currents within the ocean currents perhaps. And this coming from a balance of multiple forces, the Coriolis effect of spinning, gravity. When those are in balance, the upwelling and the incidental exchanges from all around this field becomes a possibility, a kind of a field and a soil that we might craft very specifically as an architectural fundament. I love this sense then that with some new tools and with some paradigms, an architect or a designer, an artist, can seek to make a kind of fertility today very deliberately with very particular craft. And this might offer a kind of form language, a sense of expansion. There's some particular crafts that I want to mention just very quickly, such as the quasi-periodic geometry in our own work, seeking a kind of resilience, a distributed field, and the snap-fit detailing of individual elements which harvest the elasticity of material, making hyperbolic scaffolds that are resilient, that can then be deeply clothed with structures, seeking not to resist energy, but rather to dissipate it and to share and to dynamically relax. That then spins into diagrid elements, diagonal configurations, which can hold with tremendous force and tensility, and then expanding again into a sense in which individual elements of response can create an ambience, not so much amplifying our power as exchanging and touching, harvesting in turn a kind of precariousness, a trembling in which every single bit of potential vibration and potential flux might be something that might turn into resonance. A kind of a chorusing architecture then, seeking to maximize reaction. This kind of tuning is a very deliberate and playful activity, and it's one that Iris and I tend to share, I think, of taking materials right to the very edge of their potential to span, creating a kind of precariousness as a deliberate gesture, and then in turn, activating that so it becomes possible for cascades of motion, rippling, a kind of resounding, rippling all around our bodies. In turn, that then can be seeded with inorganic chemistries that start to renew themselves, that start to show the conditions for life itself. That is, the conditions of perhaps a compartment, and of information, and of a metabolism. Just to show some of the kind of actions that happen within these cells, the simplest of compounds, in this case it's copper sulfate and potassium ferric cyanide, and you can see this lovely kind of osmotic blooming that's happening around this, and this could become a skin that could renew architecture, perhaps a little bit like ivy renewing a building in the future. Bedded then within protocell organizations, which are then fed by LED lights around them, and by breathing fronds in order to temper themselves. So I've been speaking about a sense of the fundament. Vitruvius, the Roman writer from 2,000 years ago, called this firmitas, a fundament for architecture. And I've tried to argue for a sense of an expansion and sensitivity instead. Might it be possible to think of an alternate paradigm for a next century of design? Perhaps that might be rooted in a definition, a minimal definition of living things, a compartment, information, a metabolism. My hope then is that this work does create a sense in which a firmament is expanded by reaching and gathering in realms that lie far beyond our own bodies, far beyond individual domains, not in a sense of assertion or claim, but rather in resonance and reaction. And perhaps this offers some strategies to work with a public architecture of gathering, of sharing. Is it possible to speak in confidence about the trembling surface of the world today? It's hardly possible to speak in confidence. But I do hope that the sense of craft and of involvement of this kind of work might be a contribution. Thank you. Iris and Sarah, please would you join me?
So that's, I feel like I was lulled into a cocoon of poetic words. It was really, really transfixing. So thank you so much. I'm going to see where we are. Sorry. There we go. In case, oh, and you match perfectly with your picture, so that's really nice that you can look glamorous under your photos. I really think this is a really great opportunity. I've had the opportunity to know both of these really lovely people, but incredible visionary thinkers and creators and makers. And I want to just take a moment before we dive into a conversation to give you just a little bit of background about Iris, because Philip has been so articulate about himself. And I'm in a very awkward spot because I can't actually see. So this is one of Iris's very first collections, and one of the things that's really incredible, and now I get to face you while I talk about your work, is that she never has a particular muse. She's, like Philip, really a creative, restless, intellectual person who's always sparked by different ideas and different things that inspire the kind of ideas that she makes. This is one of her very early collections that is actually made of children's umbrella tines that have been woven into this incredible kind of armature and fabric, and really speaks, it was influenced by the idea of crows, this kind of winged movement, but also, more importantly, probably the idea of alchemy, and that theme of being an alchemist runs actually in both of your works, but about transforming an ordinary object into something extraordinary. Likewise, her collection Refinery Smoke is made, looks like this floating kind of gossamer fabric, but is really made out of industrial mesh. The theme is about the kind of corrosion of the of industry, of what waste looks like. And is, if you go to see this in Grand Rapids, you'll see it has been corroding and is actually of a reddish tone and is kind of the nature of the piece. Here is Capriole, which means literally a leap, and was based on the idea of skydiving, which is something that is of a personal interest. But you can see vastly different sort of ideas, techniques. The skeleton is 3D printed, whereas the others are made of hand-cut acrylic. So the idea of craft and tradition goes into the work. And here I just wanted to take a moment to look at 3D printing. I mean, I think the idea of technology is one of the things that's been very attached to Iris and her work. The kind of scalloped shell-like forms was considered the first 3D printed work to go down the runway. But you can see the incredible influence of the organic and nature, and really inspired by all kinds of ideas. And I think one of the things that she's such a great fearless sort of champion for is the end idea, and how she gets there, and what kind of methodology she uses really is less relevant than the actual idea itself. But also what you see with that piece is one of her early collaborations, and how she is really open and willing to work with other people, and in the creative collaboration, these ideas evolve. And likewise, this is just one of the last, but I love these two examples about nature, and this is two states of water articulated in very different ways. You have the splash dress, which was actually produced all by hand, all using a sheet of acrylic and a hot air gun and pliers and loud, heavy music, I hear. And really was really handcrafted, whereas the ice dress, water crystallized, was done a few years later and was actually 3D printed and really pushing the industry to make something they still don't know. Still the story of alchemy, they don't quite know how it was produced and made to be so transparent and beautiful. This collection, the inspiration was actually Philip's work. So this was Hybrid Holism. This was a collection that was done not in collaboration with Philip, but inspired by. And I think we'll rest on this piece. This is one of the kind of key pieces of the thing. But I thought we would kind of open this up first to you, Iris, to talk about what inspired you about Philip's work and how did you pull those ideas into some of the pieces?
Yeah, this is my Hybrid Holism collection, and at the time I never met Philip, I just saw your work, and it really opened me up in a different way of thinking about fashion, because it really inspired me to think about, first of all, architecture in a completely different way, and I started looking to architecture as much more of an exploration of space. And I come from a dance background, and that's still very much part of my work today, and I've always seen the body and my work in fashion as an exploration of space. The space is just a lot smaller. But I started seeing that architecture can be very much related to fashion, where before I saw your work, I saw the possibilities of working with an architect. This piece is actually in collaboration with an architect called Julia Kuhner, but that was much more on a practical level. And I saw more the difference between the two disciplines than the things they have in common. And your work really inspired me, seeing architecture in a different way and also my own discipline. And it really opened me up in seeing materiality different and seeing even a different future for fashion.
I remember encountering your work around the same time, and so at that point, this was perhaps 6 years ago, we were in quite different worlds. There wasn't a direct dialogue. But I do remember having some intuitions about architecture as being a kind of a landscape in which perhaps a scaffolding covering the surface of the earth might be renewed and replaced by many, many different gestures, creating a sense of a field, a renewed field, something very different than the need to unify and to close. And when I saw your work, just encountered through the internet and through publication, it changed my sense of what clothing could be, because instead of one singular thing, a closure, let's say, a protection, an armor even, I started to see that that scale also could be a kind of a cellular multiplying quality in which a whole field might wrap around me. A beautiful sense of kind of participation in fertility. The very opposite almost from the kind of closure or boundedness or resistance that I thought of when I thought of perhaps my own body as a rather shy person.
So I guess the question on everyone's mind, how did you guys come together and meet? You've been admiring.
Well, I made this collection inspired on Philip's work. We've never met. Philip saw that, and then you came to Amsterdam to visit me in my studio. And that's...
I don't know whether it was my beloved partner Anne who saw that my own name was listed, or perhaps it was my mum, perhaps. But
I
it was
didn't know that.
She does the internet a little bit, you know. But no, it was a pretty lovely sense to see. Not only, of course, it was lovely to have this work associated. This was after the kind of surge of working in Venice, in which so many collaborations had come together. But along with that sheer pleasure was a sense almost immediately of extraordinary affinity. And this was before we directly spoke, but just in looking carefully at these fields of meticulously built up and organized elements, all interlinking and hovering, there was a sense of a shared language. And so we corresponded, and I came to Amsterdam. Do you remember that day?
Yeah, I remember. You brought a lot of samples with you.
Yeah, we brought a whole bag of stuff, and I sat. You invited me in for tea, and we overlooked the wonderful harbor from in your studio in Van Diemenstraat. And after tea, we sat in a couple of big overstuffed armchairs, and the conversation just began. And it lasted, I think, about 7 or 8 hours, with several cups of tea.
So I thought out of that comes this next collection, Voltage. So was that really when you first had this conversation, were you starting to work out these kind of ideas? Did it evolve very quickly after that? Do you remember?
I mean, I remember vividly. You know, I mean, we were looking at samples together, right in that very first conversation, and but then, rather than only talking about what we loved, we started talking about, I think, our childhood and sensations. I remember quite vividly talking about rolling down the hill and deliberately making ourselves dizzy. This kind of delicious sense of vertigo, of hovering and having a kind of apprehension about sensations. And that translated into these small, resilient joints, which we started putting together almost immediately.
Yeah.
And this you can see is a video of them playing with some of the material. Do you want to talk a little bit what the theme of this collection was?
Mm-hmm. The collection is called Voltage, and it was the first time we collaborated. And in my work, dance is always a big part of my inspiration and generally the energy of the body. And I started working with someone else, Carlos van Kamp, who's an experimentalist working with energy and voltage literally. So I started working with a dancer and Carlos van Kamp to try to visualize the energy of the body. And that's what I tried to find in the structures and the silhouettes of the collection as well. Yeah.
You kind of dared me to work with you on an exploding dress that would be just ferocious like a volcano, and I think I gulped and instead talked about, what about a halo? What about something much more modest, like just a little halo? You know? and we actually were rather deliberate about this sense of an energy field which might just wrap around at rather close quarters, but that would deliberately tremble.
And vibrate, yeah.
And then we started tuning the material so that could be absolutely precarious as a surface, not necessarily defensive, rather a kind of a charge, an interface between us and the world.
Well, I definitely think it's on the border of both. It's very gentle, but it's also playing with distance and attraction and repulsing, yeah.
Because it could be claws as well, and spikes, certainly, or else it could be something that...
But it could be feathers at the same time, and I think that's the balance we are looking for a lot together. Yeah.
I think it's interesting because a couple of those works, even though, the runway is one sort of experience where you see them moving and the energy that kind of creates by the ripples, but even statically in the galleries, they still have this vibrance, they sort of vibrate, they move even without it. So you've managed with the materials and the construction to capture that idea.
We were looking at how to tune a visual moire, that is the phasing, the interference patterns that would come from many, many small filaments. And that was somehow an equivalent to the touch of things extending and extending your nerves as well.
So I want to, this was something we were kind of talking about. This is a piece you've done because the collaboration and the inspirations work both ways. They work both within your collections with yours. So I wanted you to talk just a little bit about what people are looking at and where that came.
In our dialogue about the body and about the possibility field of clothing, it had the effect of encouraging me and my collaborators to think also about canopies and freestanding structures as having a sensitivity. This is the Sentient Chamber, which was erected at the National Academy of Sciences in Washington this past year. And this is a freestanding canopy made of expanded metal. Reaching up on its upper surface is salt in a whole bloom of hovering clusters, which are directly derived from the voltage collection. Reaching down are oil-filled vesicles with another set of those same fronds. And that sets up a kind of a mechanical osmosis in which the hydrophilic qualities of the salt pulling material through, and then the blooming humidity imparting qualities of the oil create a kind of a mechanical breathing. It's a very gentle kind of exchange. So in the sense of a very direct kind of translation from around the body into the possibility of a larger system.
Do you find that, one of the things I think is really interesting is the different sense of scale between architecture and the body, but also of time, the time to construct, the time, because fashion works on a 6-month cycle. I mean, how is that, how do you think that affects the kind of relationships and the way you collaborate on materials and other things?
That's actually sort of a double layering in my work. In one hand, I'm working within the fashion cycle, so I have to think in time limitations. Collection is mostly made in 3 months. So that does take certain possibilities out. But then on the other layer, I'm trying to forget about time and research on materiality or structure. I don't see it as part of the collection directly. I see it as an ongoing process within my work. So when I work with you and we are thinking about new structures or materials, on top of my mind, I'm always thinking about the next collection. But if we don't get it done before the next collection, it's still of a big use, and it will be integrated in the next one or in another project. So I'm in fashion, but I'm also out of it with one foot. That I don't want to limit myself within only thinking within 3 months, because that would take almost all of my possibilities away. Yeah, so some of the materials we've been working on it for a lot longer than a few months. It can sometimes take a year to have something growing and to have a material become mature. And I'm really happy that I found that space for myself to think almost in an architectural way, because I think fashion is often designing and working in cycles because it's so fast, and there's not a lot of time for freeing yourself from your limitations. Yeah.
So I think this is another collection where you guys really, you talked about going to CERN and the Collider a little bit in your talk. This collection came out of that visit Do you want to talk a little bit about particularly maybe the material on this one that we see, the little microwebs?
Do you remember standing right inside the chamber of the Large Hadron Collider? Do you remember what you felt when you were there?
I felt very overwhelmed, first of all, that it was all made by human hands, and it looked very crafted, actually. You referred to embroidery, which I found very pretty. And I was also really mesmerized by the invisibility of everything that was happening there at the same time, like the energy and the magnetic forces that are actually making it all happen. That's the things I remember most. Yeah.
That encourages me to remember two things surrounding it. I mean, one, if it's the largest, most unspeakably powerful scientific project ever seen in humankind, then it was absolutely astonishing to see individual wires bundled, always by hand, labeled carefully by magic marker, and thousands and thousands and thousands of those making the instrumentation that then lead us to the most unspeakably precious information. I think I also remember a sense of conversation with people there, that were speaking not only about the impossibility of understanding how things arise, but rather encouraging us to see a kind of oscillation, a potential space. We started to use terms like waffle and quantum foam, I remember. Yeah. A space of arising in a rather hesitant way, but somehow giving us language to work with potential, to work with the qualities that generate life. It was kind of a delicious experience, to, however hesitant, to start to use those terms.
And those structures are little tiny microcosms, right? Is that the little webs that you make? You want to talk a little bit about the construction of this? No, you don't?
Well, silicon
you
and
mean
acrylic.
how it is made? Or?
Yeah. Well, you experimented a lot with the materials. You guys worked together a lot to make that. So I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about how that worked.
This is made from a very thin acrylic that has been laser cut and then heated up and then pushed out by hand. And the connection points, we call them chevrons. And in this particular piece, it's silicon chevrons that are being laser cut also, and then all pulled through by hand to connect all the individual shell structures, I don't know how you halo structures. And then the whole piece is assembled by hand on the base dress that is made from a microfiber from Japan. It's a garment that is in between a dress and a coat. And we really tried again to play with the space around the body and visualizing the energy. And the whole collection was very much inspired by the visit in CERN and the magnetic forces as well that are part of that. Yeah.
You know, it would be very easy to think about this kind of expansion of the body as making a pure kind of shell. And perhaps the still photography might give that impression that this is a kind of boundary, but then when people move in it, because of all of the interlinking silicon joints to get together with the resilient, expanded diagrade individual elements, a very curious kind of motion happens, a kind of a rolling pelt. You know, as if the land itself is shifting and rolling and becoming liquid. It's a very curious kind of sensation, very, very different than, say, free rippling, let's say, and utterly different than a rigid crystal. I really loved that sense of kinetics that was discovered when these particular elements came together.
I think it's also the way the light refracts on it. When you see it moving, it also creates this really beautiful energy and airiness and kind of, it isn't like a shell, it's almost like a halo, right? It's more of that kind of, I don't know, like a burst around it.
For me, it was very important to see the difference in detailing. Like every piece is made by hand, so they're all a little bit different in length and in size and in structure. And I think together with the movement of the body, that really creates the energy for me. Yeah.
So a really different kind of fabric. And so you start, I think, you know, one of the interesting things with a collaboration that spans many years, and I'd love you guys to talk about it. I mean, it evolves as your relationship evolves, as your friendships, as you do stuff. And you start to move into not only inspiration on shapes, but materials and fabrics. And so this was from Hacking Infinity, but it was a material that you guys were working on together. Can you want to talk about that a little bit?
Shall I? Yeah. It's very connected to the collection that you saw before. Only here, this was a ready-to-wear show. I do ready-to-wear and couture, depending on the season. And here, the material was integrated with leather that was laser cut and a silk that was connected to it. So the whole thing became even a little bit more drapable and soft and more transparent towards the movement of the body as well. Yeah.
I remember we were having a discussion about sit-down ability.
Very important. Ongoing conversation.
This is an ongoing discussion, yeah. But so we worked with injection molded polyurethane for some of the links, and that created just an edge where the material became compliant and very, very comfortable, and then we took it even further into a machine-made leather that really could be very close to ready to wear. I mean, like the belt that you're working with now, this sense of individual rhombi being multiplied and then being capable of receiving extra inclusions, which could even include crystals, but certainly the interlinking chevrons. So making this cellular fabric, which then had a flexibility so that it could be completely flexible if it needed to be, or else be folded and rise into this much more kind of agitated, extended shell.
Do you feel like over time, the way you collaborate together, I mean, how has it evolved over time?
I think in the beginning is the conversations are much more about getting to know each other and trying to understand the way, well, for me, how Philip thinks and the way a structure is being developed. After so many years, all that is known, and it's much more possible to go deeper and deeper into a conversation and into the way we both work. The way I design is not by sketching something. The mannequins in my atelier are my sketchbook, so I drape the materials directly onto the mannequins, and that's how the pieces develop. So I've just been at your studio for a few days now. We've been working on new materials, and that way of designing, the drapability of a material, has become very important in the structures that we develop now. And I really feel it has moved us forward a lot. And yeah, it's just by knowing the process so much better than before and understanding the techniques and the materials Philip works with a lot. I feel the materials we make now become much more personal to me. Yeah.
We've just come from a session in the last days of very directly drawing together, and that's been a much more intense kind of collaboration. Actually, it's involved a number of people. In fact, there are many people in the audience that were just helping us draw. Folks that were in the studio, can you raise your hands just to make yourself known to everyone? Raise your hands high. Come on, don't be shy. There were about 15 wonderful colleagues that are here with you today that were working with us, exploring. And we took individual paper patterns and we expanded them out, and then we translated that into leather, and then into laser cutting patterns, working with a new kind of fabric, which started from individual forming of snail shells and spirals and corrugations, but then ended up being the most kind of radically lightweight, kind of hovering elements that were very, very thin, kind of trembling. It was really a lovely kind of push that we did. I think that's come from perhaps starting to know each other so that we could be confident in even testing and disagreeing. And I mean, you know, one of us might say, no, this isn't working. And they say, no, wait. And we just cut another seam off of it and open it up and say, no, you're wrong, look at that. And that just happened last night, actually. It was tremendously exciting to see a completely new meshwork emerge out of that kind of back and forth of not simply agreeing, but rather very playfully kind of wrestling back and forth.
I remember you saying that to me when we were talking once, that you sort of stopped being polite, like you just start really saying, oh,
Very
come on.
important. Yeah.
Well, this was one of your most recent sort of collaborations, Lucid, but I think you see, you kind of can see the trajectory of some of the other works we've seen. But how do you think this pushed and evolved the kind of stuff you had done?
Sorry, what did you say?
Well, I'm just curious how you feel like this is an evolution, of where you'd been working on, the idea of the structures and the tubes and the discs that make the armature or the kind of fabric.
You know, when I think about Lucid, on one hand, I think of very, very simple geometry. We were working with the kind of hyperbolic warping of this hexagonal or triangulated grid in the past. And the tessellation, or the individual tile works of interlinking, is something that's perhaps familiar. But in this case, building that up encouraged us to look at the most delicate operation of light, of individual acts of iridescence and of reflection. And this was done within an environment in which we also used film material. What was it called, Iris? The
Optical light film.
And this sets up a double kind of reflection, so that when you look through it, you see two images. And it created a sense of this material not simply being a form, but also being somehow an apparition of yourself, a sense of the ghost of presence that lies outside yourself, the glittering iridescence that hovers around you. That wasn't rendered conceptually. It was much more kind of a physical play with the light, of trying to tune this sense of glittering and hovering.
I think also a lot of the material development for me comes slightly also from a frustration towards all the materials that I cannot work with. And they inspire me to look at an existing material that I can work with in a different way. So the immateriality is always very visible in the textures and the transparency and the reflection towards the body and the shadow of it. So it's often very much sort of magnifying the movement of the body, and that goes back towards my ongoing fascination for dance again. Yeah.
I love these because they look like little micro-architectures on the body, so it sort of seems almost like I mean, it's where you guys intersect so beautifully because it is these structures and these things, but change the scale, change the way they move. They're moving on people instead of people moving through them. So it changes sort of the metaphor, which I think you guys do so beautifully. I wanted to ask you, because you said something that I've always wondered, what is the material you do want to work with that you can't? Like, what are these frustrating materials that you're dying to work with?
Fire is one of them. If anyone has an idea, no. No, yeah, there are so many materials. Basically, everything that I can't work with sort of triggers my mind to think of different options and possibilities towards the body. Yeah.
What about you?
Electromagnetism. Fire, for sure.
Yeah.
Human thought.
Ooh, interesting.
Blood. Not in the sense of a dark, visceral quality, but a kind of blushing, of sharing, you know? I mean, the sense of just the flux of renewal that might flush and run and roll all around us.
Okay, I'm really excited about what might be coming out. I'm just going to say that. I want to see the blushing. That sounds really on fire. Okay. So this was just, this was some great footage of you guys sort of working together. You alluded to it a little bit, but I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about some of the things you are experimenting with and where you sort of see them going, where you want to go with these things you're working on.
Yeah, you go first.
This imagery is looking at some quite fresh material. And by layering several different systems together, working with a deep, viscous, kind of fleshy element, which then might hover against some transparent fabrics. We've been working, trying to achieve individual elements on tulle. What's the class of material that tulle is? I mean, how does it behave? This sense of being barely there, you know? and then much kind of fleshier elements which stand all in an array, and then a ghost lying outside of that. This kind of expanded sense of layers is something that we're working with right now. It has a really, I don't think that we have a language for it yet. We're still getting to know the possibility of this new series, but it does have something to do with the phasing and resonance that comes from patterns intersecting but hovering apart from each other. I just remember how excited we were last night when we expanded this out finally and started wrapping it around and expanding, and the sense that it could hold light and shimmer and vibrate and just be an extraordinary expansion outside of our bodies was something that was really striking.
Well, what I've been very excited about is that in the beginning we've been very focused on the structure itself and less on the drapability for me in the design process. And I've been fantasizing about having them almost as drapable as the best fabric that I can find. And I think yesterday we found something that is beyond the best drapable fabric that I've ever seen. So we've passed my sort of hope of creating the ultimate drapable fabric that I've been envisioned, and we've gone beyond that, and that's something that I'm super excited to start working on, because it will open up my whole process again towards a new way of thinking and looking and draping, and it really feels like we've just opened up a new chapter, and we've been really going to a place that I hoped. But again, it's very difficult to talk about something that you can't actually show, because we can't show it before the show in January. But it will definitely be developed and becoming part of the whole new collection. Yeah.
The craft that we've been working with this new draping is radically fine laser cutting, which in which, by controlling the kerf, that is the amount of material that's vaporized in each cut, by getting to know that rather closely, it becomes possible to orchestrate extremely fine filaments in which every cut always makes two things. There's no waste material at all. It's only a pattern of a differential pattern of overlapping slits. And when the entire surface of a sheet is filled with that, then it becomes possible to make a radically expanded material which flows out. And then by embedding stresses in it through the articulation, the vector lines of that pattern, then corrugations and ripples and rolls start to be programmed into the fabric, which spring into life as soon as it's expanded. What was really striking was that we immediately started talking about architectural installation along with the draping. I mean, this opened up the possibility of a kind of a space that lay very directly in between the scales that we inhabit together.
No, I was going to ask you where you want to take this, right? So you're really working in one way within your practice and with yours, but where do you see new intersections that could push each other? So is architecture one of them that you'd want to? Am I making you say things you don't want to say?
Well, we've had lots of conversations about this, and we're directly working on architectural installations now. There's been an assumption somehow that architecture has a job to do which creates space, and then humans act within it. And maintaining the separation between those things is essential somehow. And perhaps we think of buildings and clothing as similar, as being two fundamentally different scales. And yet, with this experience of material being shared, perhaps it is possible to say that this is a continuum, that every bit of that space can somehow be addressed and participated in and shared. And so perhaps we could say that there's no difference at all, that it's one continuous kind of realm to work with. I think that's the sense that this next stage of working together might offer.
I think what's really exciting about what both of you do in your own sort of divisions is you transcend the functionality of your discipline. So neither of you are really working in the sort of pure pocket as fashion as only wearable or architecture that's only usable, and you're really finding the artistry and the alchemy and the sort of magic in what are those seams in between. I think I'm gonna end with one last question, which is I wanted to ask you guys, since you're together, how do you think you most challenge the other one and push them? Is it just tea choices? What do you think?
Well, there are a few very practical parts from my side, I think, that are the most challenging for the fabric making is the time, the scale, and the body limitations of the touch, the softness, even the washability, very, very practical limitations that the body provides. I think, to me, they are the challenging ones when we work, and the drapability of it. What about for you?
Well, I think you challenge me most directly in the sense of my architectural design is something that I can project in a digital model, perhaps, or in a drawing, or in a prototype, or in a large-scale social arena. And all of those projections are somehow rooted in strength and toughness and agreement. And yet, when I offer you something, you immediately drape it around your arm, or perhaps wrap it around your shoulders. And I see sometimes your skin beneath it, and we look at how it moves and how it touches you. And I become acutely aware of the possibility of making things as being a kind of an expanded physiology. The kind of sense that might be so fundamental to someone working in fashion, but to an architect, this sense that things can matter and that we can have empathy for things is an extraordinary lesson.
I want to thank everyone for coming tonight, and to Philip and Iris. You can tell there's such incredible kindredship and energy that is between them, and then you see sort of so viscerally in the work that they produce together. I want to thank the people who invited us to come here tonight to talk to you, to Acadia and Penny Stamps, and thank all of you. It's been a wonderful evening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your night. Thank you very much.